the opinion is really impressive. It goes, so one of the things to understand, this law has not gone into effect in Texas yet. So there are two ways generally to challenge a law as unconstitutional. One way, and the way typically a law is challenged as unconstitutional, is what's known as applied, which is a law is in effect and the government comes and tries to enforce it against you in some specific context, and you go file a lawsuit and say, enforcing this law against me as applied under these facts right here and now is unconstitutional. That's the way the vast majority of lawsuits about constitutionality are adjudicated. And we talked about that distinction in our last episode. But the other way to challenge it is what was happening here, and it's what's called a facial challenge. And it's a challenge that is often, and in this case, it was brought before the law even goes into effect. And a facial challenge is a much harder thing to prevail on. A facial challenge is saying there is no circumstance in which this law can be applied unconstitutionally. It is on its face unconstitutional. Doesn't matter how it's applied, this law cannot stand. The most frequent area where a facial challenge is allowed is in the First Amendment context, and there's a doctrine called First Amendment overbreadth, which is that it will chill speech. It will have such a chilling and deterrent effect that people will refrain from speaking. So this was a facial challenge, an overbreadth challenge under the First Amendment. And by the way, big tech had lots of high-priced lawyers who made lots of vigorous arguments about this. What the Fifth Circuit opinion that Judge Oldham wrote does is go systematically through and says, number one, look, this law going into effect doesn't chill any speech. And in fact, big tech is not asking for a right to speak. They're asking for a right to censor. Nobody is stopping big tech from saying whatever it wants. What this law is saying is that big tech cannot silence other speakers. And so it goes through systematically and says, well, is there a right to censor that is separate from the right to speak? And one of the arguments big tech says is they said, well, we're a publisher and we're engaged in editorial decisions about what to allow other speakers to say and not say. And there is a whole line of cases where, for example, newspapers can choose what op-eds to run and what op-eds not to run. But what the opinion does is go through systematically and distinguishes it and says, well, that's not what big tech is doing. They're not holding themselves out as a publisher and saying we're only running the speech we say. And in fact, big tech routinely represents to Congress, to its consumers, to everybody else, that they're an open marketplace of ideas and they're not responsible for the content of what they say. And in fact, Congress in Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act explicitly said big tech is not a publisher and they're not responsible for the content of what people say, which the Fifth Circuit reasonably interpreted as say, well, they can't claim to be a publisher and claim not to be simultaneously. Pick one or the other. You don't get to have your cake and eat it too.